I'm Matt Tice with the Insurgent Mindset.
I'm Rondo Moses. Hey,
Good to
Matt.
see you, Rondo.
Great to see you, brother.
Now, here we are. We're going to do our third in the series of, if you will, the U.S. political sort of challenges related to the election. Then we talked about the insurgent mindset related to, the follow-up to the election. And now here we are in this sort of highly volatile environment. And we thought it'd be great to step back and see the bigger pattern here, if there is one, and try to unpick this through the lens of the insurgent mindset, just what's going on with the tariffs and trade policy and how that affects business leaders and, really everyone else.
Yeah. Yeah, it's been an interesting week or so in the United States, probably in the world, because of the Trump's tariff announcements last Wednesday, I guess it was. And it's an interesting, I think, conversation to have because it totally, consistent with insurgent thinking at least, disrupts U.S. tradition in terms of how the U.S. has approached tariffs and its relationship in terms of trade. Um, for, the past 2 centuries, America has pretty much had like a stable um, tariff policy. It's evolved, but pretty much stable since at least 1934. But it's evolved and it's gone from, a revenue generating approach to more of a restrictive protectionism approach during the Civil War and the Great Depression. And then post that in 1934 or so, it really became more of a reciprocal tariff approach. Now, President Trump has come in and introduced a fourth, objective of American tariffs, and this is more, some would say, uh, retribution oriented in some ways. So I think it's an interesting conversation to have about what is we think of this as a strategy and how is this strategy unfolding over the past couple of weeks.
Okay, so I think that's interesting. And I think it is difficult with all the noise around this topic to bring, I guess, original thinking to the topic. But I think that it is time to step back and say, like, what's the end game here and what's the strategy? And I think for our listeners, the broader context here is to say, having an insurgent mindset and an insurgent approach without clear strategy doesn't make a lot of sense, right? So let's try to unpack a little bit what the different potential scenarios that sort of the administration is trying to achieve here. I guess the there's sort of two potentially economic scenarios that make at least some semblance of sense, right? So one is the onshoring of manufacturing jobs back to the US, right? So that policy of how do we pull levers to make that happen. We'll come back to whether or not that's the right thing to do or the wrong thing to do, but that's one thing that kind of makes sense. Another strategy that's potentially you could rationalize the idea of using this as an income generation source,
Right.
basically a tax, which is um, how do we leverage tariffs to put money into the treasury, right? So
Right.
that's also, I guess plausible from a strategic point of view, or some combination of those two. Um, Whether those are the right things or the wrong things or not, I mean, I think it's pretty widely accepted that the tariffs is a tax,
Right.
and I think it's also reasonable to assume that if tariffs were high enough, it would shield American industry at some level from foreign competition, which potentially would either require America to generate new manufacturing jobs or the onshoring of foreign manufacturers to Australia. I think that's kind of like the dogma that we're hearing a bit. Does that make
Yeah.
sense? Yep.
Makes sense, but just to add on in terms of the revenue strategy, so the debate would be who actually generates the revenue. Like, where does the revenue come from? Does it come from the countries that the tariffs are being applied to, or does the revenue come from, increased prices that American consumers would pay for the tax? I think that's the debate. And the point I think around the job creation is, there are some who would say that while there may be some industries that might benefit from tariff protection, there are other industries that rely on exports that would be disadvantaged by tariff protection because, all those countries would retaliate, as some have threatened to do and are doing, and those potential industries could lose employment. So there's an open debate about, the revenue creation, where does it come from, as well as the job creation as well.
Okay, well, let's break those down. We'll start with the plausible, at least semi-rational scenarios first, and then we can talk about some of the more, you know, potentially nefarious scenarios, if you wanted to sort of put it that way. But all right, so to deal with your question around who pays the tariff, I think that's reasonably clear. The importer pays the tariff, but fundamentally that tax, if you will, the tariff, can either be pushed down to the supplier, right? Or it can be eaten by reduction of the profits of the company that's importing the product, let's say Walmart or Ford Motor Company or someone like that, or it can be passed on to the consumer or some combination of all of those things, right? So at some level, ultimately, though, wherever that is, the end consumer is going to feel an impact to that and is paying the tax. I wonder, and I understand that tariffs and taxes are probably not widely understood as the same thing, but if we accept that it is a tax
Hmm.
and it is a tax largely on the American consumer, it seems to me a better approach to have addressed this issue. If you wanted to tax the American consumer, a GST or a VAT tax would have made more sense, right? But okay, we have we have these tariffs and the idea that is the idea. I think it's also worth understanding, like, why would you use tariffs and under what circumstances do tariffs actually make sense? And
Mm.
to me, there's three broad reasons, right? So one is you want to protect an industry, okay? So typically, a good time to use tariffs is, for example, when you're trying to build an industry and you want to shield that industry for a period of time to give it the oxygen it needs to kind of scale and then grow and evolve. And then progressively, you would reduce the tariffs and um, expose that industry to international competition and all the great things that are related to competition that would make that industry stronger over time, right? So that
Right.
to me, that's number one. Okay. And that's a good reason to apply a tariff in certain circumstances. I think the second one is defensive in a sense where, let's say, for example, another country is bringing in goods at below their cost. It's called dumping, right?
Dumping. Yeah.
So, in other
Yeah.
words, like for example, China or Korea or Japan, somebody um, is making steel, for example. They have an excess capacity or excess supply of steel, and they don't want to carry that cost. They want to carry the inventory, so they dump it on other countries, and that's damaging to onshore manufacturers who can't compete at that cost. And it's unfair. So I think there's
Right.
a backdrop, and this is I suppose virtually every country has done that at one point or another, but it makes sense in certain industries. You can't compete with somebody who's offering their product at a cost lower than you can manufacture it, particularly for commodities, right? So
Right.
that's not great. And then the third one's a little bit more nuanced. You can imagine a situation where the product that you create at home is worth a lot more abroad than it is inside the country. Okay. So,
Hmm.
for
Hmm.
example, this is like the Canadian cheese scenario, right? Where, you got this wonderful cheese. Let's say Americans will pay twice as much for that cheese than Canadians will. So Americans want to buy up all the cheese, and it's not available then for the Canadians who can't consume their own cheese. So you could imagine sort of tariff barriers or other trade barriers to be put in place to reserve some capacity for domestic consumption, for example, right?
Hmm.
Or maybe after a certain quota, the tariff goes up so that you're sort of shielding that after Canadians have a bite of their own cheese, forgive the pun there, then you know what
Right.
I mean? So
Yeah.
there's a kind of a marginal tariff on that, right? That also makes sense. But these sort of peanut butter broad-based tariffs, um, really to try to manipulate the macroeconomic sort of tax or onshoring and manufacturing jobs is very rough as a tool.
Yeah, I get what you're saying, and I agree. I'm just concerned that in this situation, I should say the concept is that it's so broad based. When you look at that, more than 180 countries were impacted by the announcement of this tariff, as opposed to, taking a more targeted approach in the way that you seem to describe it, that, either we want to protect, emerging industries in the US to give them an opportunity to be able to compete globally, or, there are specific industries that we see as more strategic to our national interests, and we want to use tariffs to protect those industries. I get that. But I think it's more of the broad breadth of the tariffs and the fact that we took the same approach, whether you were an enemy of ours or a nemesis of ours versus an ally. I think that that's really where some people are taken aback. We're taken aback by the whole tariff approach. I also think, as you know, yesterday, the president announced a pause on the tariffs. So now the 10% still is in place in all the countries that it was applied to, including Canada and Mexico. But the reciprocal tariffs are on pause for 90 days. The tariff on China, of course, went up an additional 25%, and China responded with an additional, I think now their tariffs up to 84%. So I just think it's also the lack of cohesion in terms of the plan and the approach and the broad brush in which the administration went out to apply this tariff is, I think, what went back. Even if it was for a revenue generating purposes, when you look at it, for example, in the context of Europe, we applied tariffs in Europe where we actually have a trade surplus in
Hmm.
Europe. So, someone could say, well, okay, I could see you saying, let's match tariffs on auto, where so we can match that, but let's not apply tariffs on goods and services because America has a surplus.
Okay.
So,
So
so
that
let's,
brings us to the other scenarios, right? So I think, why would you do it on such a broad-based, across all 180 countries? Why would you tax Vietnam and the high
right,
40%, right? For example, all these things, right? So I think there's a like sort of a non-economic political scenario here, which is about almost like shocking the system to communicate that um, America is in charge here, however unfounded that might be. But clearly, this has created a global panic at some level, and people are queuing up to negotiate now these trade agreements. So the shock to the system strategy may be, again, plausible. It's unclear whether this is actually what, and we'll never know because whatever, I guess in the after action of all this, what we'll hear will be whatever the grand plan was from the beginning, regardless of what it is. So it's
right,
hard to say, right, what actually is happening. But I think the shock the system strategy would be, really how do we get people to the table to create more favorable trade relationships for the United States. Now, to your earlier point, I wonder the cost of that in terms of why you would give up so much political goodwill
right,
in exchange for what ends up being a marginal improvement on your trade relationship with a huge trade bloc, the European Union, where, for example, where you historically had good relationships and now you have no relationship, right?
right,
It doesn't make a lot of sense. Or here, I'm in Australia. Um, Obviously, we also um, the US enjoys a trade surplus with Australia. So the idea that Australia is a bad actor here somehow and ripping off the United States doesn't make a lot of sense, right?
Hmm.
So, would does it make a lot of sense to alienate Australia politically to get a very marginal benefit, for example, on improving trade relationships over Australian and U.S. beef, which really seems to be the main focus? I'm
Right.
not convinced that that strategy. I hear it and I understand it intellectually, but I'm not convinced makes a lot of sense that you would give up the political goodwill for marginal trade benefits,
And the
right?
other, I
Yep,
was going to say the other thing is, whether that approach brings your allies closest to you or pushes them away, right? So, do you create an opportunity for China to strengthen ties with, some of our allies? Or it just, to me, it sort of it pushes the U.S. Away from our allies and not brings them closer. When I look at the 2017, actually 2018, 2019 renegotiation of NAFTA, um, in the end, through all of that, there was no additional financial gain that the U.S. got out of those negotiations. In fact, the new agreement is pretty much like the old NAFTA agreement, except
mhm,
for some enhancements around labor, et cetera. So I just wonder, to your point about, the destruction of trust that it took many years and decades to build is now in some cases probably gone. And how do we get that back? So even if you do a deal, I'm not sure how long it would take, but what does that do to the long-term relationship with these allies, people that we've
absolutely.
been trading partners?
A very recent example, one that's sort of unfolding right now, is related to they call it the AUKUS arrangement between the United Kingdom, Australia, and the United States over submarine development, nuclear submarine development, and virtually right now, this deal is being reviewed in the UK on the basis of can the UK trust the United States as a partner? And if the UK decides to pull out of that deal, it will have major, major negative implications for Australia here, both in trade, because we're spooling up literally a whole industry around this, but also in security and our political position in the region. So it's a significant problem. I think the cost of that sort of a strategy is very high for, as you point out, potentially a very small benefit. Now
Right.
there's a fourth strategy, and I think one more after that. The fourth is wake everybody up in terms of building on the third one, create the shock in the system,
Hmm.
wake
Hmm.
everyone up, and then, and this appears to be where we're heading, is then isolate China, who, for whatever reason, seems to be perceived as, the major antagonist in the trade relationships. Now, there's probably very little doubt that over the years, China has been um, pushing the boundaries of the trade friendship on dumping, on IP protection, on labor, on lots of things, right? So, the queue of WTO cases are, go out the door with China for there's
Right.
no doubt about it. But at the same time, you have to wonder whether or not um, first, is it going to work? So I think 20 years ago, if this approach might have been um, much more successful when China wasn't quite as independent and didn't quite have its own economic house in order. But this is now a game of chicken
Right.
where who's going to feel the pain the most first and who's going to blink. And I think the one thing that Americans don't understand about the Chinese is that um, the Chinese will not lose face. Okay,
No.
so basically, I think the Chinese will ride this out on the basis of if it's a game of egos. Um, I think the Chinese has a very strong argument that the Americans have more to lose than the Chinese has to lose, and nobody has anything to gain here, really. We
Right.
talked about Tesla and BYD in our most recent episode, and you sort of unpack that. Like BYD is one of the leading electric vehicle manufacturers on the planet, isn't even exposed to the US as a market, right?
Right.
So, and China is more and more independent economically than it was a decade ago, certainly 2 decades ago. So I think that's a tricky one. I'm not convinced. And since you've gone and poked all your neighbors in the eye, all your allies and friends,
Right. Are
whether
they
or
going to come
not
running to your side?
whether or not they're going to join, the pressure to isolate China is it seems less likely to me, right?
And all of the activities around the regional alliances. I mean, BRIC, for example. I mean, these regional alliances are starting to take on, I would say, much more influence than that's been happening for the past decade or so more. And so now, does this accelerate the focus on those regional alliances as opposed to the global alliances?
Right. And I think one of the collateral, it's collateral damage, not collateral benefit, right? Or a collateral benefit to China, probably not so much to the US. On that is kind of this long-term strategy that China has to initiate de-dollarization, where slowly but surely the dollar as the world's reserve currency is eroded.
Hmm.
And I don't know whether the yuan or the euro or something else sort of plays that role or whether it creates a different balance, but certainly that's a long-term intention that China has, is to undermine that. But then we have a situation where this whole trade Armageddon almost is an own goal, in a sense that the United States is undermining its own currency, right?
Right.
So we saw obviously what's happened with the bond markets over the last 48 hours. We could probably talk about that in another podcast, a bit technical, but you can see how there's a whole parallel story here floating around how currencies are a big part of this story. So I guess the last scenario is this really just to serve um, to serve the ego of the administration or Donald J. Trump. And
Right.
I don't want to spend too much time on that, but there seems to be a perception that the world's been ripping off the U.S., and that perception was sold to the base of Trump and his allies. And so consequently, to your point, retribution also seems to be a part of the story here. But let's not get wrapped up in that one. But I
Yeah.
think if we go back to the first one, this notion of manufacturing, if that is kind of the back, or at least that's the story that seems to have been sold to Americans, right? Rondo, why does it make sense to bring manufacturing back to the US? Does it make sense?
Oh,
And is
okay.
it possible?
So I guess for me, I'm thinking about it in terms of the types of jobs that would be created. Like I think it was Dave Chappelle, the comedian, told a joke years ago. I think it was in 2017, 2018, when Trump was, negotiating the tariffs with China, and he said in his show, "Why would we want to make?" He says, "Why would we want to make Nikes? I don't want to make Nikes. I want to wear Nikes." Right?
Mm.
And I think that's the mindset of a lot of Americans. One, I don't know that those types of jobs would pay enough for Americans to have a living wage. When you think about, at least the image we have of Chinese factories are, in essence, sweatshops, right? People really can sew, people making products at very low cost that wouldn't work here. So what you would have to do is protect more, I would say, higher tech industries. That's why I think, what the Biden administration did with the CHIPS Act and, focusing on the semiconductor industry was smart because you would be creating higher paying jobs in that instance. So I don't know that that makes sense. In addition, looking at it through the lens of investors and the capital flow, I mean, can you really even think about companies taking the risk of investing in factories when they have no confidence in the certainty of these tariffs, whether they will actually stay on, whether they will actually be able to find the labor that they need to deliver in those factories? I think it just opens up a lot of questions and doesn't provide a lot of answers.
All right, I totally agree with everything you said. I think in reverse order, could you find the labor, right? So,
Right,
really, at least up until January, the US was at a relatively, historically almost low unemployment. So, there isn't a lot of labor sloshing around in the economy. So, and do those people have the skills that are required to do that work? We don't have people that can sew Nike shoes, right?
right,
I think we don't have the engineers that are required to make iPhones, right? We don't have the machinists required to build ships. So, these capabilities don't exist really largely. So it's a
right.
very long game to build these capabilities at enough scale to make up the difference. So to me, that doesn't seem right. So I guess the second point is the lower wages. Why would you invest a huge amount of energy to average down the wage in the US? That doesn't make a lot of sense to me, right? So certainly you can see the benefit in a Rust Belt town that had manufacturing, doesn't have manufacturing, and now is destitute as a result of that. Certainly that's problematic.
Right.
There is some room for manufacturing, put an auto plant there or whatever, but the sort of whole broad-based approach to bringing back every manufacturing job doesn't doesn't hold water to me. And I guess then the question is, do we need these jobs strategically? So I think the answer to that is both yes and no. So sneakers, we don't need those jobs, right? Somebody
Right.
else can do that job better. They have more experience. What we're really good at is design and really good at sort of the branding and the marketing around that. And that's valuable. It's part of the value chain. What we're not good at is sewing sneakers.
No, sneakers. Exactly.
You know what I mean? Now, to your point, AI, um, it's clear that making those chips is really important. And we have a lead on that. And firms like NVIDIA, who we've talked about before on the podcast, are ahead of the pack on that. We need to nurture that and preserve that and make sure that we're able to maintain that comparative advantage. But not every component of those chips or those chip assemblies are going to be made in the US.
Right.
You want to be able to leverage the best capability that's available to maintain that superior technical edge, right?
Right.
So that's another one. Now, I think the one industry to me that we're really deficient in, and we talked about this ahead of the podcast, I think, is shipbuilding. So we are so far behind China and also Korea in particular in our ability to build ships.
Mhm.
I read somewhere that the total tonnage of all the ships that were developed by that were launched by the U.S. since World War II is less than the total tonnage delivered by China in the last 2 or 3 years. Okay,
Wow.
so that's a huge gap. And for example, if you just look at our Navy, the China's is sort of upwards of 400 ships. We're just under 300 ships. You could argue that tonnage in the U.S. is a little bit higher, mainly because the aircraft carrier fleet. Um, but we're falling behind there, and we can't build the ships fast enough. And almost the only thing I agree with in the whole sort of Trump policy in the last couple of weeks is the deal with Korea to share technology and to get the South Koreans to build ship hulls for the U.S. Navy. Um,
Hmm. Hmm.
and which is interesting because now that's offshoring the jobs that we have in one of our most critical, deficient strategic industries.
Right.
So I really don't get it, Rondo. It's like we're trying
Right.
to bring back low value manufacturing jobs, but we're ignoring the high value jobs or the strategic jobs that we really need.
Right, but here's the other thing too. Usually, the way you bring back that kind of an industry, the low wage jobs or the manufacturing jobs, you would do it in a public-private partnership approach, right? It would be, and companies would have to have some confidence that they are going to have the resources they need, the advantage in the market that the government had sort of put on the table. But I don't know if they're going to have that confidence with this administration because of the sort of, the way things have been rolled out over the last couple of weeks. Now that's a pause on, even if, at the end of the 90 days, he continues, to say, okay, we're going to keep the pause on. I think there's a lot of uncertainty there, that people are going to say, hey, I'm not sure. How can I plan around this? Because I'm not,
That's a great pivot. Yeah.
how can I plan around this? Because I'm not sure. So it's going to make it difficult to do capital planning as well.
Absolutely. Are you going to put that, you got the 90 days. Are you going to make the decision to put that plant down in Indiana somewhere when, you're not really sure, are the tariffs going to be on? Are they going to be off? Now,
Right.
fair enough, if you were on the fence about putting that plant there 3 months ago, and you might get some political value out of putting that plant down there, you might make that call. But are you going to do a greenfield project that wasn't already in your planning queue? I'm not convinced, right?
Yeah.
So I wouldn't. And I
Yeah.
think one of the good news is at 10%, I think the currencies will all adjust to the 10% and probably won't make that big of a difference really in the scheme of things. But
Hmm.
it's sort of an unnecessary 10%. It's like, who cares?
Right.
Some currencies will go up, some will go down, it'll adjust. It's sort of like that'll just be the new normal. Um, Fine. But I agree with you. Like for business leaders, you need certainty. You need
Right.
to understand what's the playing field and be able to make sure that those decisions, which might be 10, 20, 30-year decisions, are going to pencil out in terms of return on investment. And I don't think I'd be putting a plant in the US. In fact, I might do the opposite. I might be spending a lot more time thinking about how can I diversify my my footprint and find new markets for my products and probably also some services to take some of that risk out of the equation. The other
Right.
thing we didn't talk about this is that you mentioned the BRICS, and I just want to come back to this briefly. I think that one interesting plausible possibility is that the rest of the world starts to isolate the US in some uber macro free trade agreement, right?
Mm,
Which,
hmm.
you know what I mean? Which would be very damaging, where if China and India in particular in the EU kind of came together and said, let's create a trading bloc, right? And eliminate trade barriers across this block, and isolate the US out of it. I think it's plausible.
That's
Uh,
plausible.
and I think it would be extremely damaging. But back to business leaders, I think you're absolutely right. The strategic planning conversation now really has to be scenario heavy because you don't have a clear line of sight to where this is all heading. So you almost have to, dust off that scenario planning book and your
Right.
game theory book and sort of start thinking about, okay, now there are several plausible possibilities here, and how do I create strategies that sort of meet the conditions of most of them, to the best of my ability with my available resources. And I think that, many companies, and we've talked a lot about this, many companies are very lazy and they're thinking about kind of these big macro shifts and strategies to address those.
And I think that, just thinking about the scenario in terms of reshoring, I think that companies can't make that decision because of the uncertainty. But even beyond that, I think given the current environment, lots of business leaders are feeling very uncertain about the future. And so it will probably delay decisions that they're making about hiring or new product launches, et cetera, until they get more certainty as to where things are headed. So
Hmm.
I think it's having a ripple effect in the economy.
Right. So I guess zooming all the way back, like this is clearly an insurgent approach, right? So rightly or wrongly, Trump is saying, and his team are saying, I'm unsatisfied with the way this all works. We're being ripped off, or whatever. We need these jobs back. Whatever the grand plan is, which is obviously opaque to us. Um, but whatever that grand plan is, um, the team there has decided that the direction of travel, the historic direction of travel, is not working and that somehow they need to tear that all up and do it differently, right?
Okay.
I think that there is merit in thinking that way and saying, okay, well, we can't expect the same outcome by doing the same thing, sort of the Einsteinian definition of insanity. But I think where you have that insurgent approach without clear strategy and well-defined outcomes,
Right.
right? And very poor execution.
Very poor
Without
execution.
those three things, they all have to come together, right? So I think the insurgent mindset depends on speed, it depends on really clear strategy, and it depends on um, being able to execute with precision. And
Yes.
without those ingredients, what you end up with is chaos, and that chaos can be very self-harming. So, we certainly wouldn't advocate for companies to apply this approach, which is, to jump all in, to blow up an industry, for example, but then have no way to consolidate the value in terms of how they would take advantage of that.
Right.
That
I
doesn't
think you hit the
make a lot
nail
of
on the
sense.
head. I think this is a lack of a coherent strategy and the lack of disciplined execution. So it's just failing on both dimensions of what we know are required for success.
Mm. So it'll be interesting to see how it plays out. I think in this podcast, we've tried to at least get the bigger pattern. So maybe there'll be some durability to that. But over the coming weeks, obviously things could change, or even tomorrow, we'll see. So it's a very dynamic situation, and we look forward to maybe revisiting this in a month or two to see where it's all landed. But for
Absolutely.
now, I'm Matt Tice with the Insurgent Mindset. Great to see you, Rondo.
And I'm Rondo Moses.
All right, all the best. Talk soon.
Take care. Bye.